Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about form text and buttons. So on our HTML page, we have some basic form elements. We have some text input, we have a date input, we have radio buttons, a checkbox, and some regular buttons which we might use to submit the form once it's been filled out by the user. We're going to start by styling those text inputs and the buttons at the bottom of the form. These are the easiest elements of a form to style using CSS, and many of the techniques that you've learned so far in the course will work immediately when styling these elements. For example, let's take a moment to style the input and to notice that each of these elements has an ID. So let's target the input with the ID of text. That's going to be this second text input on the form. So let's select using ID with the ID selector. Select text, and one thing we can do is set a background color. Now I'll paste in an RGB value. This should be a cyan background. Let's refresh. We can now see our text box has a cyan background. That might be too much depending on the theme of our page, so we can also set the opacity or the alpha channel of this RGB color. For example, let's see what happens if we pass 0.3 as the alpha value. Now we get a more subtle effect on the background of the form. Other values will work as you might expect as well. So for example, we could set the height to a different height if we wanted to. Probably won't spend too much time styling the height and width of these inputs since the defaults are pretty good, but the point is we can do it if we want to. Another thing we can also do is style the padding in that text box, and usually you will set some kind of padding value. I'd like to introduce you to another property, and it's called background clip. And what this does is it decides how far the background spreads. For example, should the background color cover the padding itself, or should it just cover the content? So if we set the value to content box, we'll see that that background color does not cover the padding. So we get a line around the inside of the text box, which denotes the padding. Now we can set a specific padding value. For example, if we set padding 5 pixels, we'll have 5 pixels padding all the way around the inside of the text input. So this is one style we might choose to make use of. We have some theming there with the background color of the box. And we also indicate to the user the actual text input area, since it's a slightly different color to the padding. Now, once this element's in focus, you notice that it has a blue outline around the input. And depending on the color theme for our site, we might not want a blue outline. We might want the outline to tie in with the selected color theme for our page. So we can configure that using outline, but we don't just want to configure the outline here on the main element. This would work, but you'll see what the problem is. Let's set this to solid 2 pixels cyan, because that ties in with our background color. And we now have an outline that's a more appropriate color given our theme, but notice what happens if we click on other elements on the page. We still have that outline there. And the whole point of the outline is it's to indicate to the user that that form field is currently active. So if the user were to type something on their keyboard, it's going to appear inside that form input. So we only want this outline to be in place when the element is in focus. So we can make use of a pseudo class for that. So let's just remove our rule from the overall text selector. And now let's set a pseudo class of focus. Let's refresh the page. So now only if that input is selected do we see that cyan border around the edge of the element. Now, if we think about the different ways we can style text, that applies to the input box as well. So we could change the color of the text with color, set it to dark cyan. Now when the user types in that box, they have dark cyan text. Another thing we might do is text align center. Now when the user types in the box, we can see that the text originates from the center of the box. Another thing we might do is style the corners of the input box itself. So we could set border radius. Let's set this to 25 pixels. And you can see we now have a curved text input field. So let's now move on to styling these buttons. Now we don't technically have an ID on those button inputs. They're actually inputs with a type of button. So let's focus on that. We can actually use an attribute selector here. So let's search for input And remember, we can provide some square brackets here and say type equals button. And just to test that, let's set a background color on the button to red. Of course, another thing we could have done is just assigned an ID to that specific button. Then we could have targeted using the ID selector, but it's good to keep brushed up on the various CSS selectors we covered earlier on in the course. Now, usually we want everything to tie in with a theme, so we might actually borrow the previous RGB color. We can always change the opacity of that color to produce different effects. Let's see if we can get our buttons tying in with that text input. So let's make the color a bit darker for the button. Let's try 0.7. And we can style many of the same features of this button that we did with the text input. For example, if we wanted rounder corners, we could set a border radius. It doesn't have to be as extreme as a text input. Let's try 10 pixels, for example. We could even have a more subtle effect. Let's try 5 pixels. So you can see it's a square button with slightly rounded corners. The other thing we might notice is that text is fairly cramped inside the button. So we can, of course, set some padding. And one of the things I like to do with buttons is I like to have only a small amount of vertical padding. So let's say 2 pixels, but I like to have quite a bit of horizontal padding. So let's use a 2-value system, 2 pixels and 8 pixels. So you can see the width of the button spreads out. We perhaps don't even need 2 pixels for the vertical padding. Something like this makes an effective button. You can see we could even have 10 pixels, 1 pixel like this. So we get some width to our button, but not too much vertical padding. Just so you know, these are inline block elements by default. So if we wanted to, we could actually specify a width on the button as well. That would potentially be too wide in this context, but sometimes you might want a button that appears this way. Now, we mentioned earlier in the course, we can actually make use of box shadow to create some nice textural effects on the buttons. And what we'll do is we'll use the inset value for this. So let's set some basic values and then let's experiment with our shadow. So we need to set a color. Let's try gray. Let's see what we get. So you can see now we have a nice textured effect on our button. We could experiment with different colors for the shadow itself. For example, what if we set it to a darker color? That's actually quite a nice effect on the button. Another thing we might do is actually specify a second box shadow because it's nice to have the 3D effect that we looked at earlier in the course. So let's set 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 5 pixels black. Now we can see our button has a 3D effect. And remember as well, we can style the active pseudo class on the button. So if we just copy our selector, we can specify pseudo class active, and we can copy this box shadow rule because we maybe will keep the first element of the box shadow, but we maybe don't want that 3D effect once the button is depressed. So let's have a look at this. So now when we click on our button, there's a minor animation effect that makes it look like the button's being clicked. In fact, we could just set box shadow none. And then you can see it also removes that shadow on the button, which again might make a more realistic animation effect. It's up to you to decide. Okay, so that was buttons and text input. Most of what you know already applies, but keep in mind that we need to style some of the pseudo classes here. So for example, we styled the focus pseudo class for the input text so that when that field is active, we can see we have the outline surrounding that field. And we also styled the active pseudo class for the button so that when the button is clicked, we can see the styling changes and indicates to the user you are in fact clicking this button right now. Now, as we can see, not all aspects of this form's theme have been configured, so we'll talk about that in the next part of the course.